Kia ora katoa no mai haere mai. Welcome, everybody. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the different lands on which we gather today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and those in the audience today. So hello, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for tuning in. Thank you to Robbie for a great introduction earlier for the next couple of days, to Professor Trembath, who gave a very interesting presentation in which I think proves that everything these days is very much science-led. And many thanks to the New South Wales Treasurer and Minister for Energy and the Environment, the Honourable Matthew Keane, for his thoughts and vision on the way ahead for New South Wales. My name's Nigel Brunel, and I'm Head of Commodities at Jarden, based in Auckland. My specialty is carbon markets, Australia, New Zealand and international, and I've been asked to chair the next two sessions on carbon markets in COP26. So in this session for the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to be chatting with John Connor, who's the CEO of the Carbon Market Institute, about what is happening at COP26 and domestically in our marketplace. Look, I'll dispense with a formal introduction as it gives us more time to talk and take questions. Needless to say, John is extremely experienced in the carbon market and policy space. So John, welcome, and thank you for making the time to have a chat with us. We've known each other for quite a while, and you have quite a history in all things carbon. For those that haven't met you or don't know CMI, could you tell us a little bit about CMI and your role around things? That would be great.
Great, thanks Nigel, and kia ora, and to everyone, and also I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country where we're all meeting. I'm coming to you from Gadigal country and not Glasgow country. So with the first time in 6 years I've missed a COP, and I've been going to them for over 20 years now, off and on at some of the critical ones. I'm now 2.5 years into the stint here at the Carbon Market Institute. I did have a couple of years working for Fiji as their executive director of their COP23 secretariat. So some deep experience about how these things they work. And I should say, before I just introduce CMI, I mean, it is very important to understand the extraordinary nature of COPs. They are there's actually the formal negotiation process happening in the blue zone, and these are like the Olympics of international diplomacy. 196 countries. Any one country can stick up their hand and veto progress in other elements. And we've got the process where a bit down pat now, where we have the world leaders at the very start, and to try and get it a bit of momentum, and rather than at the very end, as we had in Copenhagen, which actually led to a bit of a road crash there. In the green zone at these COPs, you've got about some 30,000 people, and it's a bit of a mix between a trade fair and a big day out in terms of the various things and shows and other things going on. And again, lots been happening in that space as well. We can have a chat about some of those. But firstly, let me talk about CMI, Carbon Market Institute. It's a unique organisation, and we've got over 120 corporate members right across the carbon value chain in Australia, New Zealand and the region increasingly. And we've got that from primary producers through to carbon project developers, carbon service providers, all the big banks, and a number of other financial institutions, legal companies and others, through to emission intensive companies, BHP, BP, Woodside and the like. And I guess it's three things. It's an industry association, and so we do a range of events and forums, and I've got a big summit coming up at the end of the year. But secondly, we're also stewards of carbon markets and carbon and centre of excellence around those. And so we've got the world's first carbon industry code of conduct, now in operational phase, taking complaints and independent review panel. This is a really important part of establishing a proper and well-respected crediting industry in Australia. And we also work with intensive companies as they try through the transition strategies and the bewildering array of terminology and taxonomy that we're seeing emerging about what the hell is carbon neutral, what's net zero, what are the transitions, what's actually meaning with this, and all the various scopes we work through with them. And finally, and quite importantly, it's actually also a champion of the Paris Agreement and the goals. So what does it actually mean when we talk about trying to keep well below 2 degrees and pursue 1.5 degrees, but also what are the processes involved? And so we generally take delegations. We've got a few other of our member companies there under our banner, but for the first time, not one of our team members there with COVID restrictions. So that's some of the work that we do and the experience that we have.
That's great. Thanks for that, John. And yeah, and I can certainly vouch for the usefulness and what good value and very worthwhile being members of CMI, which we have been for a number of years. And I think for anyone that's looking to find information and find the right people and sort of work their way through policy and just learn all the different things around the carbon space, it's definitely worthwhile and very good value in doing that. Just before we sort of move on, just a little bit of housekeeping things. So to the audience out there, look, please explore the conference website. Under the info tab, you'll find the conference agenda, presenter biographies, and company profiles. And besides that is the Q&A function. And through all presentations, we encourage you to type your question here and we'll ask them on your behalf. So, John, so sort of moving on to COP26, I suppose what we're sort of into day 3, it's the other side of the world, so it sort of would have just sort of finished day 3. I mean, your experience here definitely gives us a good intro. And obviously you were helping the Fijian COP president back 2 or 3 COPs ago, and you've been operating in this space for some time. My own take in chatting with Kay Harrison, who's our ambassador for climate change in New Zealand, was there was probably a number of things that are pretty crucial to the COP26 talks. I mean, they're always, interesting. My first one was a couple of years ago in Madrid, and I mean, it is a big day out, and it definitely takes a little bit for the first timer to get used to, but incredibly valuable to be watching those. But the sort of things that seem to be sort of important here are they're not letting go of the 1.5 degree target. And obviously the climate financing is crucial here, as was promised to start in 2020, and hasn't really started. It's a bit behind the 8 ball, the $100 billion a year. And obviously Article 6, which some people might not even know what that's about, but it's a very, very important thing that needs to be resolved. And maybe any other comments or thoughts you might have around how the COP's progressing. Be really interested to hear what you've got to say.
Yeah, look, as I said, it's a big mix of vaudeville and serious stuff when we come into the negotiations and things. And so this COP in particular was meant to be an ambition COP focusing on the 2030 and 2050s. Remembering this was supposed to be end of last year and the actual real kickoff of the Paris Agreement and its process. And so the Paris Agreement is particularly important because it has inbuilt ratchet mechanisms which kick in every 5 years. And you have then in between that global stocktake. And so we'll have a global stocktake in 2023. And in 2025, countries are supposed to come forward with their next NDC, which will largely be around 2035 targets. Now, we've seen that ambition crunch, and it's a political moment. We've seen how that's driven countries, including Australia, to up their commitments. 2050 net zero commitment, that's welcome. Unfortunately, we don't have enough on the 2030 and this decade from Australia. And of course, New Zealand had its 2030 goal increase announced the last couple of days as well. I'd love to hear your take on that in detail, perhaps in a moment. But and it is important to understand that the Paris Agreement and this process itself has actually had an impact. We've wound back where we thought we're heading to around 4 degrees to around 3 degrees, largely through some of the processes kicked up from the Paris Agreement itself. But of course, that's well short. We still have very dangerous global heating with that. And so we need to continue to ratchet it down. And I think it is important to recognise that alongside the Paris Agreement, another number of other channels have really got running as well. So it's important, as I said in our latest update a couple of days ago, COP26 is not the only channel to be watching now. The Task Force on Climate-Related financial disclosure got kicked off at Paris as well, and so we're now seeing extraordinary work going on in central banks and in institutions, and some key action and really determinative action is happening in other channels like the EU taxonomy on sustainable investments and the like, and other areas. And so, and of course, World Trade Organization as we work through carbon border adjustments. To the COP itself, so we've seen some of that ambition. Some of it's good, some not so good. People were pretty impressed yesterday with India coming forward with a net zero by 2070, but also very strong 2030 goals. We've seen overnight important commitments around methane and deforestation, some targets there. And interestingly also, really, it's now critical and was put on display how finance and investments are bundled into this. It's not just a matter of corralling politicians now, it's actually about corralling the financial streams as well. And so I think there was 8.7 trillion under management that was committed to the Global Deforestation Initiative, for example, and we're seeing other and similar commitments around methane. So people need to look not just at the political actors, but also the investor actors that are out there as well. So that's some important stuff. And then down to the nitty gritty, the grind around Article 6, which is the rules for the carbon markets. As I said, been kicked down the road for a few years now, and there's been some traditional areas of blockages. And so, again, for those not aware, Article 6 is that aspect that deals with carbon markets. There are three main sorts of markets dealt with under Article 6. 6.2 is the one between countries. 6.4 is establishing a market mechanism which carries on from the Kyoto Clean Development Mechanism and setting up the rules there, particularly for companies to be trading. And 6.8 are some other non-market measures. What are the rules for all of those? Key barriers in all of this have been what sort of proportion of market trades might go into other financing measures. So you see some clipping of the ticket in the Clean Development Mechanism that goes into the Adaptation Fund. So it's a fund that helps developing countries, and it is really important that developing countries are saying we're not going to move unless there's substantial financial contributions from the countries that have benefited the most over the last couple of hundred years from the carbon. So the rules for how what percentages might go through into similar sorts of funds are still to be worked out, and do they happen at all under 6.2 in the between countries? What sort of can you carry through from the Kyoto mechanism into the Paris mechanism? A lot of the spotlight was on Australia about trying to carry over some of its alleged overachievements under the Kyoto Agreement at a national level. There's a whole lot of projects that were developed up under the Clean Development Mechanism. How far back can we keep them going for? What sort of vintages are still alive, if any, into that Paris mechanism are a key stumbling blocks, and also just the very nature of the corresponding adjustments. So if something happens in one country, an investment, and you take away the carbon rights, what happens to those accounts in country and the country from which the investments are being made? They're the real nitty gritty of the negotiations. And I guess one of the key tests that people look to is the bracketed text. And so a bracket in the text is actually the areas which are still being threshed out, and the fine words and things which lawyers spend hours over and the like. And if that's any indicator, Nigel, we're starting off not bad. I think the Madrid text had about 570 square brackets, and we're down to about a bit over 300 in the text that was dropped overnight. So some cautious optimism around the momentum and into the actual details itself.
And I think a lot of people, would benefit by once in their lives going and visiting. And I think it's classic sort of multilateralism at play, and I think that's what you certainly realise when you are there, and if you're a sort of a student of this world, that every state has its own sovereignty, and every state has a voice, and it certainly is quite amazing to sort of watch. So, and I've seen one question come in, which sort of leads me into sort of ask you something a little bit sort of around Article 6, because I know that these COP are supposed to finish on the second week on a Friday, I think Friday evening or whatever, and I think in Madrid, it was going through to Sunday afternoon trying to resolve Article 6, and they effectively just gave up. And I think it just goes to show how difficult some of these negotiations are, certainly parts of it. So do you sort of sense, or you're slightly confident that we'll get a resolution to Article 6 and get a framework for the global trading of carbon credits?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is important to say that we already have a bit of a framework there, and we're seeing global trades under the Article 6.2. So Peru making deals with Iceland and Peru making deals, and some other deals already being there. The Australian government's looking to centre its Indo-Pacific offsetting scheme under 6.2 as we work through some of the details. So some stuff can actually happen already, and I think that's very important to note. But obviously it'd be more streamlined, and if we can actually get the rest going and properly. As I say, I think we're making some progress. It is a real part of the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle that's in the negotiation. So it would have been ideal to be done in Katowice in 2018, and the idea was to bundle all of these elements together. Now we have this stream by itself, and it's a bit sort of it's a proxy for all sorts of other political shenanigans that are going on and chest beating. And as you said before, these are arenas of national interest being competed out there, and that can somehow sometimes influence into those elements. But look, cautiously optimistic at this stage. I think you can guarantee we'll be into the Saturday or the Sunday to do that. It's partly because people hold their final cards right close to their chest to the very end.
Thanks for that. And I think the issue around obviously the climate financing, which is so important. I think people, certainly the audience, should understand. And this is one of these sort of classic North versus South kind of situations where, having been there and seen, a lot of the developing countries sort of pointing fingers at the developed countries, saying, "Well, you sort of caused this problem," and the developed nations sort of around to developing, saying, "Look, we can't let you go where we've been because it's not going to sort of solve the problem." And even talking to some of our negotiators over there around how they can, virtually every meeting, they can see or feel or actually hear that accusation sort of coming to them around sort of problem. But that's interesting, some of the pickup that we're hearing from COP around the financing side of things. Obviously, the move to have 100 billion of financing per annum starting in 2020. But I heard a number listening to some of the COP summaries, and I heard a number that I sort of had to sort of rewind and sort of re-listen to it. That they're potentially talking about 100 billion sort of dollars required if we want the whole world, including developing nations, being net zero by 2050. And then the sort of talk coming from the likes of Boris Johnson and a couple of others was they're really now looking to the private world or the corporate world to actually start providing some of this. I mean, have you got any thoughts or comments on that? I mean, that's just numbers that are just, I know we're used to big numbers now with the global financial crisis and COVID and all that kind of thing, but what are your thoughts on that? I mean, it just seems just
well, I think I think some of that refers to the total investment needed to make this transition, and that includes also the investment that would take place in the energy sector as well. And so we're starting to actually see that from what might have been a traditional investment and what is a sort of a clean developed investment, if you like, seeing that premium close as we're getting the affordability up. But the affordability and even the technology itself is one thing. Having the policies that pull it into place and pull investments into place are the critical things that we need to be having, because that 100 billion figure, by the way, is for finance, and it's often forgotten. And so everyone does like to go for the public and try and put the pressure on the governments. But it is mechanisms like carbon markets, which actually, with good rules, can actually have that investment going in and actually making this stuff more efficient. So one assessment from the International Emissions Trading Association said that if we get these rules done properly, we could be saving $250 billion a year in efficiencies from markets. And if you put that into emission reduction, that's another 50% emission reduction. It highlights the importance of these things. Look, there's a question there about, is there appetite to make advance on this? One thing which is quite unique now to these discussions is the fact that this is taking place in now where we're seeing voluntary markets exploding into action. And I took voluntary in inverted commas because that's generally happening under pressure from investors and consumers and shareholders. But they're tracking about $1 billion a year now, is one estimate I saw. And it's going to be a selling point in Glasgow that, in fact, if countries in developing countries don't agree and developed countries don't agree, then they might miss out on some of the action of these markets. So markets are happening despite the negotiations, not just because of them now. And that's quite a new development.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think they're going to have to find another name for voluntary markets because I don't see a lot of voluntary sort of action. But also, to be fair, I think there's a lot of corporates that actually want to do things. They're a bit tired waiting for the international policy, which is a bit like, boxing a glacier sometimes how slowly it can sort of develop. So, and 90 countries under Paris need access to international markets for Paris and beyond. So I think hopefully we'll get a development there. Well, just with some of the time we've got left, I thought we might just move to sort of what's happening domestically. And there's been quite a lot as some of it, what you've sort of outlined with, Australia coming out with a net zero pledge and the Nats coming on board. Certainly things seem to be moving in the right direction. So what are your thoughts around that? I mean, my thoughts on the views that I think Australia's got the potential to have an amazing carbon market, and it's actually got a lot of policies on the table that could theoretically be knitted together. But do you think that's going to happen? Are you sort of finding the government receptive, or we've still got a bit of a tin air on sort of climate policy and carbon price?
Well, I think you can say what you like about Australia's policy ambition, but you're right. Australia's policy architecture that survived the demise of the carbon pricing mechanism is actually there as a springboard for greater ambition and action this decade and through to 2050. And it's recognised pretty well internationally that we do have a system of high credibility. Now, there are challenges to that and happening right now as well. And I think there's a broader attacks or criticisms around use of offsets and market mechanisms, which is underway because of the lack of ambition and trajectory primarily. But Australia does have a good system of registering Australian carbon credit units and developing methods for that. We've got some independent processes. There's legislative instruments. Participants in the market have to have financial services license. We've got our code of conduct now, which actually is buttressing this as well for project developers and the like. We've got a safeguard mechanism, which is actually a measure to measure and in fact actually purchase. And last year was about 1 million tonnes in the compliance market, which is dipping into that spot market that you guys measure. And I was astonished to see just before that we've clocked over $36 a tonne now in some trades. And so it's gone up, as I've said, faster than house prices this year. The ACCU spot market prices, $16.50, I think it started the year at. So that's an extraordinary boost. But importantly, if we do, and what I was delighted most is we've now got very big players in business association, the Business Council point to this safeguard mechanism, because carbon markets have to be a means to an end at the end of the day. And it's actually lots of fun and games out there at the moment. It's a lot of froth and action, but if it doesn't be on a trajectory with emissions reductions, then we're going to get blowback, and we'll see this scheme blow up in front of us. And I think people should be very concerned about that, and we should be focused on that.
It's a very good point you make, certainly around talking about markets, which most financial markets don't have a means to an end. But of course, a carbon market, especially around government policy being a government construct, is a means to an end, and ideally the end of carbon. And certainly, I suppose one day, we might see. Well, I don't necessarily think we'll see it, John, but I think we'll see, the price potentially heading to zero if we're doing the job right. So hopefully that's good. Now, we've just only got sort of 5 or 6 minutes left, but there was one question that came in that I thought I just posed to you, and I could probably also pose it to the next session as well. And that's just interested in your view of the federal government's new safeguard crediting mechanism. The question here is, why create new credits when there are already ACCUs?
Yeah, look, it's a very interesting question, and I think again, if we didn't have, if we had ambition and declining baselines under the safeguard mechanism, then you may not have as much criticism. So this is an initiative that trying to, at the moment, most of 2/3 of the action in the auctions have been in the land sector, and it hasn't mobilised some of the industrial investments and reductions in crediting that it might. Now, we're actually seeing a fair bit of action in that since this idea was first floated some 12 months ago. So there's questions in our mind as to whether it's better to address by having another method. The government's putting up $280 million, which is not a lot, to drive some of this and perhaps have some auctions or other processes there. So we understand some of our members think that's actually important for internal CapEx decision making to have such a vehicle, but we're most concerned that, particularly in the absence of greater ambition for the mechanism, then we're setting up this other credit. And again, what we might be doing is shooting ourselves in the foot right at the time when the ACCU is starting to emerge into an international stage as a credible instrument itself.
No, very, very good point. That last one, we're potentially coming into an international market framework to potentially pop those credits up there. They could be problematic. John, we've just got a few minutes left. I thought I'd just take that opportunity for you just to give us any of your closing remarks and sort of thoughts and ideas, and obviously just remind people of your upcoming Carbon Summit, and maybe we can just go out with you just for the next couple of minutes. Give us a little bit of a summary of how you see things.
Yeah, look, I think we're at a very critical stage, and I've been in this job now 2.5 years, and it's really exploded into action in the last 6-12 months. Not only the carbon price, but the focus and on the market, the development of terminologies, and the instruments that are being applied, and the pressure that's being put on the marketplace. So we're seeing Greenpeace say we shouldn't have offsets. We're seeing attacks on the nature of carbon crediting, nature-based solutions, and indeed some of the methods, and some of which are pretty poor, but they can strike a resonance that eat away and corrode the market and market confidence. Now, we need to be able to back in the integrity and show that and actually deal with it if there are issues, but there's some very real issues. So we've just seen the Science Based Target Initiative actually put out new definitions around net zero and the transition, and reinforcing what we should have as the hierarchy of avoid, reduce, and then offset. That's important. But I do think it's also important that if we do believe in the market, that we look to markets to actually drive low cost abatement as well, and get the value that you can from nature-based solutions, the additional benefits. We're in a biodiversity crisis as well as the climate crisis, and so we should be looking to how we mobilise both. And so I think companies will need to get on the front foot about talking about how they're climate positive, whether that's in full carbon neutral mode or how they're using their investments in the shorter term, as well as doing their decarbonisation, the staircase that goes on. So there are going to be real battlegrounds over the next 6-12 months to couple of years, as well as the need for ambition, because the climate crisis is going to keep kicking in, but the opportunities are going to keep knocking in, and we're seeing global capital move around and away from carbon intensive companies and countries, and so that those other channels I mentioned are really significant and are only going to deepen as well. So all of that and more we'll explore at our summit on the 9th and 10th of December at the International Convention Centre there in Sydney. We're delighted that it looks like that will be in person, but we're also doing hybrid options as well. So go to our carbonmarketinstitute.org, and you should be finding our events thing the summit. And we really hope we might even let you get across the ditch, Nigel, to join the panels and other participation.
Thanks, John. But I only got about 40 seconds left. I just said there was one final question that sort of popped into the box. I thought I might address that really quickly. Is it possible to explain what happens with these countries that do not make their NDC targets? Is there a wash-up process? Just very quickly, and we'll talk about that in the next session as well. It is a voluntary agreement, so there is no, if countries miss their targets, they miss their targets. But as you can see with other things that are happening out there, free trade agreements and so forth, it might backfire on some of these countries that don't try, at least to try and make those targets. John, look, thanks so much for taking your time to share those thoughts. That's been, really valuable. I thank the audience for the questions, and we're going to take a break now from 10:40 to 11. But I'm back at 11 o'clock, and I'll take us to the next session, which is on the future of carbon trading and markets, and I'll be joined by 3 very experienced participants. Thanks again, John. Really good seeing you again, and enjoy the break, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Nigel.